Most smartphone DSLR or mirrorless cameras can shoot video using automatic settings. This is the fastest, most convenient way to shoot video. But if you want to shoot more professional, cinematic-looking footage, then you'll want to use manual settings. For the last 2 years, I've been shooting short films using smartphones. The short films are episodes for a series called Silent Eye, which is currently on Amazon Prime. We've been using Samsung S8, Samsung S8 Plus, and Samsung S9 smartphones using the camera app FiLMiC Pro. So you can see here some clips of some of the episodes. Everything that follows is really what I've learned from using this app based on my experiences shooting video on a smartphone. So what I'm going to go through here is just over the basics of using manual controls to get the most out of your smartphone. If you're new to photography or filmmaking, these settings can be a bit overwhelming at first. So in this video, I will cover each setting with a basic introduction and explanation. Most smartphones, including iPhones, do not provide manual settings when shooting video. There are some exceptions, such as the Sony Xperia 1 and Xperia 5 models via a native app, FiLMiC Pro. However, there are a number of third-party camera apps which can be installed to allow manual settings control. The most famous of these apps is FiLMiC Pro. However, you need to check with your model of smartphone to see how compatible it is with the app. There are some differences between manual controls on a smartphone compared to a DSLR or mirrorless. One notable difference is the lack of an aperture setting. Aside from these minor differences, all cameras function using the basic principles of photography, which have been established for decades. With video, compared to film, there are new settings to look at, such as resolution, bitrate, and bit depth. Note, for this video, I will use the FiLMiC Pro user interface for graphic illustration. So let's get started. Focus is probably the most understood of all camera settings. Like our eyes, a camera lens needs to focus on a subject for the subject to appear clear and crisp in the image. What happens with focus depends on the situation, other settings such as aperture, and the lens used. There are two basic rules of focus. Smaller aperture plus wider lens equals more things in focus. Wider aperture plus longer lens equals less things in focus. This phenomenon is often referred to as depth of field. If you want to know how to create blurry backgrounds and the currently popular bokeh effect, your quest is for a shallow depth of field. In FiLMiC Pro, the focus is set using the rectangular icon, usually found in the middle of the screen somewhere. To set focus, move the rectangle over the subject. The inbuilt focus mechanism should then work out how far away the subject is and set focus correctly. You should see the lens system adjusting. To focus on a different subject, move the rectangle again. In this example, I am moving the rectangle over the chair, and the camera system adjusts the focus distance. When we're filming, we want the shot to look smooth and professional, so we need to lock the focus at one distance. To do this in FiLMiC Pro, tap the focus rectangle and it will turn red. Now, when I press record, the focus will remain at the same distance, even if I move the camera or if the subject moves within the frame. To unlock the focus, tap it again and it turns white again. If you want the focus to change during the shot, tap the focus rectangle. The rectangle now changes to a larger rectangle with intermittent lines. In this mode, the focus will adjust the focal length depending on the distance of the subject within the rectangle. Note that when you have FiLMiC Pro in autofocus mode, the rectangle is fixed in place, so you can only focus on what is at the center of the frame. Before you start filming, you need to decide on the resolution of the video. Ultimately, resolution defines the number of pixels contained within one frame of video. As a general rule, more pixels equals higher quality and larger file sizes. Higher resolution also requires greater processing power when recording, playing back, editing, or adding effects. Currently, consumer cameras, smartphones, iPhones, DSLRs, are mostly restricted to 4K as their highest resolution setting. Open the settings menu by tapping the small cog icon. In the settings menu, tap Resolution. The next screen provides a number of options. The middle controller with the left and right arrows can be used to set resolution. On my device, which is a Samsung S9, the following resolutions are available: SD 540p, HD 720p, HD 1080p, 2K 1152p, 3K 1836p, and 4K 2160p. Aspect ratio defines the shape of the video frame. You can see FiLMiC Pro offers a number of preset aspect ratios. Most often, we use the 16:9 aspect ratio when shooting or watching video. This ratio has been the current standard for many TV screens, smartphones, and computer monitors. However, the choice can be creative or down to specific presentation needs. While choosing an aspect ratio other than 16:9 only places a guide overlay in FiLMiC Pro, switching crop to overlay on produces a video with the selected ratio. In FiLMiC Pro, below the resolution setting control is the bitrate control, where it says FiLMiC Extreme in this example. FiLMiC Extreme is the highest setting. Like with resolution, the higher you set this, the higher the quality, at the cost of higher file sizes and greater need for processing power. If you are going to put your video through various processes like grading and effects, then it's best to have the highest bitrate your devices can manage. Frame rate, or frames per second, is the number of frames captured or played back in 1 second. As with resolution, high frame rates create bigger files and require more processing power. However, capturing more frames in a second doesn't necessarily create higher quality video. If you want to mimic the look of film, then choose a frame rate of 24 or 25 frames per second. Then set your shutter speed to 1/48th or 1/50th. These settings will add motion blur to your video, similar to when using a film camera. 30 frames per second has been the standard frame rate for TV for years. The slightly higher frame rate gives higher clarity, which is good for sports and factual programs like news reports. Usually the default setting of smartphones and other consumer cameras is to shoot at 30 frames per second. Anything at 60 frames per second or above is usually used for slow motion effects. However, in recent times, many people have started to prefer the clarity of high frame rates played back at the same rate. Meanwhile, detractors argue that this looks too synthetic or too much like video. Depending on where you are, artificial lights flicker on and off a certain number of times per second. If you find your video contains artificial lights which flicker on playback, you can prevent this by changing the frame rate. For example, in Europe, setting your frame rate to 25 frames per second matches the 50 Hz electricity supply. In the USA, a 30 frames per second frame rate will match the 60 Hz electricity. To set frame rate on FiLMiC Pro, you need to go back to the settings menu and tap the frame rate button. You will now get a screen where you can set the frame rate. Available frame rates are in dark grey. The lighter grey rates are only available depending on other factors, such as resolution or device. For instance, due to the processor demands, higher frame rates are sometimes only available at lower resolutions. A video's exposure is controlled using a number of settings, all of which have an effect on the look of the video. Those settings are ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. ISO is a measure of how sensitive your camera's sensor is to light. When an image is too dark, we can increase the ISO to make the sensor more sensitive to light. When an image is too light, we can decrease the ISO to make the image darker. There's an unfortunate side effect to increasing the ISO. This comes in the form of greater, more noticeable digital artifacts in the image. This is called video noise, and it is one of the reasons people are interested in the low light performance of cameras. This is particularly a problem for smartphones and iPhones. Compared to bigger cameras, these devices have small sensors which are not as good at picking up light in low light situations. As a general rule, when shooting with a smartphone, it is best to try to keep the ISO at or below 100. The shutter speed setting in a video camera is the amount of time the shutter is open, letting light onto the sensor. For example, 1/48 will set your camera to expose the sensor for a 1/48 of a second per frame. Now the basic rule is faster shutter speed equals a darker image. A slower shutter speed equals a lighter image. But shutter speed doesn't only control the exposure, it also changes the amount of motion blur in the frame. The basic rule is faster shutter speed equals less blur, slower shutter speed equals more blur. Now, to mimic the look of film, motion blur is desired, and the basic principles are fast shutter speed plus high frame rate equals smooth, clear video. Slow shutter speed plus slow frame rate equals motion blur, film look. Fast shutter speed plus slow frame rate equals choppy and harsh images. All these three settings are desirable to create different styles and effects, depending on what you want to achieve. The aperture is the size of the hole which allows light through the lens onto the sensor. In photography or videography, the aperture can be changed in size by what are known as f-stops. The aperture also has the effect of altering the focal length. The basic rules are small aperture equals less light plus deeper depth of focus. In other words, more is in focus. Big aperture equals more light plus shallow depth of focus for blurry backgrounds and the bokeh effect. Smartphones usually come with a fixed aperture. To adjust these three key exposure settings on FiLMiC Pro, first open the manual controls. This is done by tapping the circular icon to the bottom left of the screen. Two wheel controllers appear at the sides. The right wheel is used for focus and zoom. The left wheel is used for ISO and shutter speed. Move the left slider wheel up and down. Moving the left slider wheel up and down will change the exposure settings. You should see the screen go brighter and darker as you move it. The settings to the left of the wheel are ISO, top, shutter speed in the middle, and aperture at the bottom. Now you may have a desired frame rate and shutter speed combination. For example, 25 frames per second and 1/50th shutter speed, which equals the film look. Once you have set the frame rate, mine is at 25 frames per second, move the left slider until the shutter speed says 1/50th. Now lock the shutter speed by tapping it. The shutter speed setting should turn red, and your frame rate and shutter speed are now fixed. Now, your frame rate and shutter speed are locked, and you're left with two manual settings which can be adjusted to set exposure. These are ISO and aperture. Using a smartphone or iPhone might mean you have no aperture. Well, you have no aperture control. Even if you do, it's only one stop difference anyway. So this means we are left with really only the ISO as our exposure control. In FiLMiC Pro, you move the left wheel up and down to adjust the ISO level. Now, there are some issues with ISO. The first one is, if you are in a low light situation, you might find you have to move the ISO above 100 or 200, and past this level, we can start to expect that there will be extra noise artifacts in the video. On the other hand, if you are in a bright light situation, you might find you cannot reduce ISO enough for correct exposure. You know, if you've pulled ISO down to its lowest level and the image is still overexposed or kind of washed out looking. Problem 1 solutions. Add more light, reduce shutter speed, or you can always fix noise in post. Problem 2 solutions. Shade the subject from the light, or you can increase shutter speed, but you will lose motion blur. Or you can also use an ND filter. Setting white balance ensures you are recording colors as accurately as possible with your camera. Different light sources have different color temperatures. Modern digital cameras come with sensors which can attempt to set white balance automatically. However, they are not locked in place while filming a shot. Again, your shot will look messy if the white balance changes during the shot. So, to shoot professional looking video, the white balance needs to be locked. But first, you should set the white balance as accurate as you can. To set and lock white balance using FiLMiC Pro, tap the color circles icon, which is in the bottom left. This opens up the white balance settings control. Even if you don't have time to set white balance correctly, you should at the very least lock the white balance so it doesn't change during the shot. The circle in the big square indicates the white balance settings graphically. It's also represented by the two long columns on the right. If you just want the temperature number, it's displayed bottom left. To get a more accurate white balance setting, with the AWB Auto White Balance icon blue, aim the camera at something white and non-reflective. Now tap the Auto White Balance icon so it turns red. White balance will now be locked for the duration of the shot. Alternatively, tapping the Auto White Balance icon until it changes to orange means it will set the white balance automatically, but lock the setting during the shot. As I said earlier, for high quality video, most professionals lock off their manual settings so that nothing changes during the shot. If focus, ISO, white balance and so on are changing during a shot, then it looks more like a home movie, more messy. Of course, there are times when you want to use auto settings, either for creative reasons or for speed. So this is just the very basics of manual settings for video. With this knowledge, you should be able to get shooting professional looking video right away. But if you want more detailed information about any of these topics, we do have more in-depth articles on our website. So I will leave links to those in the description. Check those out if you're interested. So that's it for this video. If you haven't done so already, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.